Rob Halford wasn't ready for Ozzy Osbourne's letter, and he broke down. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Rob Halford's Birmingham home as he sorted through his mail with his usual methodical precision. Bills, fan letters, industry correspondence, all routine until his fingers touched an envelope that made his heart skip a beat. The handwriting was unmistakable, shaky yet determined, spelling out his name in the familiar scrawl he'd known for decades. It was from Ozzy Osbourne, postmarked just 3 days before the Prince of Darkness had passed away on July 22nd, 2025. Rob's hands trembled as he held the letter, not yet daring to open it. He and Ozzy had shared a brotherhood forged in the fires of heavy metal's earliest days. Two Birmingham boys who had conquered the world with their voices and their unyielding passion for music. They had supported each other through the darkest times, celebrated each other's triumphs, and maintained a friendship that transcended the competitive nature of their industry. But nothing could have prepared him for what lay within those pages. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on Rob's shoulders. Just weeks ago, he had stood alongside thousands of other mourners as Ozzy's funeral procession wound through the streets of Birmingham, past the Black Sabbath bridge where fans had left flowers, candles, and heartfelt messages. The Black Sabbath singer's coffin was driven along Broad Street in the city centre, a route that saw the cortege pause at a bridge named after the band he helped found nearly 6 decades ago. The sight of Sharon, Kelly, and Jack Osbourne, their faces etched with grief, had nearly broken him then. If this story touches your heart, please show your support with a like. Your engagement helps us share more meaningful stories about the legends who shaped our world. With deliberate care, Rob finally tore open the envelope, his eyes immediately filling with tears as he recognized not just Ozzy's handwriting, but the effort it must have taken to write it. His primary cause of death was ruled as acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, and out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, with coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease with autonomic dysfunction listed as associated factors. The Parkinson's disease had made even simple tasks monumentally difficult for his old friend. Yet Ozzy had somehow found the strength to put pen to paper one final time. "My dearest Rob," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then the crazy train has finally reached its last station. Don't you dare cry for me, you magnificent bastard. Save those tears for something that matters. But I needed to tell you things that I never got the chance to say properly when I still had the voice to say them." Rob collapsed into his favorite armchair, the same one where he'd sat countless times over the years, receiving phone calls from Ozzy about everything from tour plans to family troubles to random 3 a.m. thoughts about music and life. The chair seemed to embrace him now as he continued reading, each word a testament to their enduring friendship. "Do you remember that night in 1975 when we were both broke as hell, sitting in that dingy pub in Birmingham, dreaming about making it big? You told me then that music wasn't just about the notes, it was about the spaces between them, the silence that makes the sound meaningful." I never forgot that, Rob. Every performance, every album, every moment on stage, I thought about those spaces. You taught me that, without even knowing it. The memories flooded back with such intensity that Rob had to set the letter down for a moment. He could practically smell the stale beer and cigarette smoke of that long-closed pub, could see young Ozzy's animated face as they talked about their musical heroes and impossible dreams. They had both been unknowns then, just two working-class kids from Birmingham with voices that could shatter glass and hearts full of ambition. That particular evening in 1975 had been a turning point for both of them, though neither had realized it at the time. Rob had just joined Judas Priest, while Ozzy was struggling with his place in Black Sabbath as the band's popularity began to soar. They'd met by chance at that small venue in the Digbeth district, both nursing warm beers and nursing wounded egos after particularly brutal rehearsals with their respective bands. "The thing about this business," Rob had said that night, gesturing wildly with his pint, "is that everyone thinks it's about being the loudest, the fastest, the most shocking. But that's not it at all. It's about the moments of quiet power, the spaces where the audience holds their breath." Ozzy had nodded enthusiastically, his eyes lighting up with understanding. Like when the crowd goes silent before Iron Man kicks in properly. That moment of anticipation. That's pure magic, that is. They talked until the pub closed, then continued their conversation walking through the empty Birmingham streets. Two young men who had found in each other a kindred spirit, someone who understood that heavy metal wasn't just noise, it was art, it was emotion, it was a way of speaking to the souls of people who felt like outsiders in a world that didn't understand them. I know we've had our differences over the years. God knows I've been a difficult friend to have. The drinking, the drugs, the madness that came with this life we chose. But through it all, you never gave up on me. When I was fired from Sabbath in '79, you were the first person to call. When Randy died, you flew across the ocean just to sit with me in silence. When Sharon was sick, you sent flowers every single day for months. That's the kind of man you are, Rob. The kind of friend this world doesn't deserve. Rob's vision blurred as tears began to fall freely now. He remembered those moments Ozzy referenced, but he had never considered them extraordinary. They were simply what friends did for each other, what brothers in metal did when one of their own was hurting. The fact that Ozzy had treasured these gestures enough to mention them in his final letter spoke volumes about the depth of their connection. The firing from Black Sabbath in 1979 had devastated Ozzy, not just professionally, but personally. He'd called Rob at 3 a.m. from a hotel room in Los Angeles, completely drunk and barely coherent, sobbing about how he'd let everyone down, how his drinking had destroyed everything he'd worked for. Rob had stayed on the phone for 4 hours that night, listening, offering what comfort he could, and ultimately convincing Ozzy that this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. "You've got something special, Ozzy," Rob had told him. "Something that no band, no matter how successful, can contain. Maybe it's time to let the world see what John Michael Osbourne can do on his own." Those words had planted the seed that would eventually grow into Ozzy's legendary solo career. The irony wasn't lost on Rob. Black Sabbath's loss had been the world's gain, as Ozzy went on to create some of the most iconic songs in heavy metal history. The letter continued with stories Rob had almost forgotten. Late-night recording sessions where they'd push each other to vocal extremes, practical jokes they'd played on unsuspecting roadies, philosophical conversations about the responsibility that came with their influence over young fans. Ozzy wrote about the pride he felt watching Judas Priest's meteoric rise, how he'd boasted to anyone who would listen that Rob Halford was not just the metal god, but his personal friend and Birmingham brother. "Remember that tour in 1982 when Priest opened for my solo shows? You were nervous as hell about following Randy's death, worried that the crowds wouldn't accept you, that they'd resent Judas Priest for taking the stage where Randy should have been playing. But I told you then what I'm telling you now. You belong on that stage, Rob. You were born for it." That tour had been emotionally brutal for everyone involved. Randy Rhoads had died in that horrific plane crash just months earlier, leaving Ozzy devastated and questioning whether he could continue without his brilliant guitarist. The decision to continue the tour with Judas Priest as support had been controversial, with some critics suggesting it was too soon, too insensitive. But Rob remembered standing in the wings before Judas Priest's first show of that tour, watching Ozzy pace back and forth, his face painted with the theatrical makeup that had become his trademark, but his eyes showing real vulnerability underneath. "I don't know if I can do this without him," Ozzy had whispered to Rob. "Randy was special, you know. He made me better. He made the music better." "Then do it for him," Rob had replied simply. "Randy would want the music to continue. He'd want you to keep reaching those kids who need to hear what you have to say." That night, both bands had played with an intensity born of grief and determination. The audience had sensed something special was happening, and by the end of the evening, there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. It had been the beginning of one of the most successful tours of the 1980s. But more importantly, it had proven that the spirit of heavy metal was bigger than any one person, even someone as irreplaceable as Randy Rhoads. "I need you to know something, Rob, and this is the most important part of this letter. When I performed that last show with Sabbath at Villa Park, sitting on that black throne because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, I looked out into that crowd of 40,000 people and I thought about legacy. Not the albums or the awards or the money, but the people whose lives we touched. The kids who found strength in our music when they had nowhere else to turn." Rob paused his reading to gaze out the window at the Birmingham skyline, where he could just make out the spires and buildings that had shaped both their childhoods. Osbourne played his final show, billed as "Back to the Beginning," alongside the original lineup of Black Sabbath at Villa Park in Birmingham on 5th July 2025. He had been there that night, watching from the side of the stage as his friend gave everything he had left to give. The Back to the Beginning concert had been more than just a farewell show. It had been a celebration of everything Black Sabbath represented, everything they had achieved, and everything they had given to the world. Rob had watched from the wings as Ozzy, unable to stand due to his Parkinson's disease, had commanded that stage from his black throne with the same magnetic presence that had captivated audiences for over 5 decades. The setlist had been carefully chosen to represent different eras of the band's evolution. War Pigs, with its anti-war message that had resonated across generations. NIB, showcasing Ozzy's incredible vocal range. Iron Man, with its heavy, mechanical rhythm that had influenced countless metal bands. And Paranoid, perhaps their most recognizable song and the one that had first introduced many fans to the world of heavy metal. But it was the moments between songs that had been most powerful. Ozzy's voice had been weaker than in his prime, roughened by decades of smoking and the effects of Parkinson's, but his words had carried more weight than ever. He'd talked about Birmingham, about growing up poor and angry, and finding salvation in music. He'd thanked his bandmates, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, for taking a chance on a working-class kid with a big voice and bigger dreams. "This city made us," Ozzy had said, his voice echoing across the stadium. "These streets, these people, this spirit of never giving up no matter how hard life gets. That's what you hear in our music. We never forgot where we came from, and we never will." The crowd's response had been thunderous. 40,000 voices raised in appreciation not just for the music, but for the authenticity, the honesty, the refusal to put on airs or pretend to be anything other than what they were. It was that authenticity that had always set both Ozzy and Rob apart from their peers. You and I, we didn't just make music. We gave voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless. Every kid who ever felt like an outcast, every teenager who couldn't fit in, every adult who still carried the scars of being different, they found us, and through us, they found their own strength. That's our real legacy, Rob. Not the platinum records hanging on our walls, but the lives we helped save simply by refusing to be anything other than exactly who we were. The letter went on to detail specific memories of their friendship that only the two of them would know. The time they'd gotten completely lost driving to a festival in Germany and had ended up performing for a crowd of confused farmers at what they thought was the venue. The evening they'd spent in a Tokyo hotel room, both homesick and exhausted, singing old blues songs until dawn, just to remind themselves why they'd started this journey. The countless phone conversations where they'd supported each other through divorces, deaths, health scares, and the inevitable loneliness that came with life in the spotlight. One story in particular stood out to Rob, a memory he hadn't thought about in years. It was 1984, and both bands were at the height of their commercial success. Judas Priest had just released Defenders of the Faith, while Ozzy was riding high on the success of Bark at the Moon. They'd both been booked for the same festival in Sweden, and after their respective sets, they'd found themselves alone backstage, sharing a bottle of whiskey and talking about the strange turns their lives had taken. "Sometimes I feel like an imposter," Ozzy had confessed that night. "Like any minute now, someone's going to figure out that I'm just a scared kid from Aston pretending to be this big rock star." Rob had laughed at that, not mockingly, but with recognition. "Mate, if you're an imposter, then so am I. And so is every other person who's ever stepped on a stage and tried to connect with strangers through music. Maybe that's what makes it real, the fact that we're all just making it up as we go along." That conversation had changed something in their friendship. They'd stopped trying to be anything other than themselves around each other, stopped putting on the armor that fame required them to wear in public. In private, they were just John and Rob, two friends who happened to have ended up living extraordinary lives. "I'm writing this letter knowing that my time is running short. The doctors, Sharon, the kids, they all try to protect me from the truth, but I can feel it in my bones. This old heart of mine has been through too much, carried too much pain and joy and madness. It's tired, Rob, and I think it's ready to rest." Rob had to stand up and walk around the room, the weight of Ozzy's prescience almost too much to bear. According to the outlet, the certificate says Osbourne died of A, out of hospital cardiac arrest, B, acute myocardial infarction, C, coronary artery disease and Parkinson's disease with autonomic dysfunction, joint causes. His friend had known somehow that his heart was failing, and yet he'd chosen to spend his remaining energy reaching out in love rather than withdrawing in fear. The last time Rob had seen Ozzy alive had been just a week before the final concert. They'd met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Birmingham, away from the media attention and the pressure of public appearances. Ozzy had seemed frail but determined, his hands shaking from the Parkinson's, but his eyes still bright with the intelligence and humor that had always defined him. "I want to ask you something," Ozzy had said over their meal. "When this is all over, the concerts, the interviews, the whole bloody circus, will you remember me as John? Not as the Prince of Darkness or the crazy bat-biting guy, but as John, your friend?" "Of course," Rob had replied without hesitation. "That's who you've always been to me." Ozzy had smiled then, a genuine expression of relief and gratitude that had stayed with Rob long after their lunch ended. Now, reading his friend's final letter, Rob understood that conversation differently. Ozzy had been saying goodbye, in his own way, while also seeking reassurance that their friendship had been real, that it would survive beyond the spectacle and the headlines. "But here's the thing that gives me peace. I know that our music will outlive us both. Somewhere right now, there's a kid picking up a guitar for the first time, because they heard War Pigs or Breaking the Law. Somewhere, there's a young person who feels different, weird, like they don't belong, and they're finding strength in our voices. That's immortality, Rob. That's how we live forever." As Rob continued reading, Ozzy's handwriting became increasingly labored, but his message remained clear and heartfelt. He wrote about his gratitude for their shared journey, his admiration for Rob's talent and integrity, and his hope that their friendship had meant as much to Rob as it had to him. He shared his fears about leaving Sharon and the children, but also his confidence that the love they'd built together would sustain his family through their grief. The letter revealed Ozzy's thoughts about his final years, his struggles with Parkinson's disease, and his determination to keep performing as long as his body would allow. He wrote about the frustration of watching his physical capabilities diminish, while his mind and his passion for music remained as strong as ever. "The worst part isn't the shaking or the fatigue. It's the feeling that I'm becoming invisible, that people see the disease instead of seeing me. But then I remember that night at Villa Park when 40,000 people sang every word to Paranoid, even though my voice wasn't what it used to be. They weren't singing along with the Ozzy from 1970 or 1980 or 1990. They were singing with me, as I am now, in this moment. That's when I knew it was okay to let go. Waitium. I need to ask you for one last favor, my friend. When people talk about me after I'm gone, and God knows they will, I want you to remember that underneath all the madness, the Prince of Darkness persona, the controversial headlines, I was just a working-class kid from Birmingham who loved music more than life itself. Yes, I bit the head off a bat. Yes, I did crazy things that probably shortened my life. But at my core, I was always just John Michael Osbourne trying to make sense of this beautiful, terrible, wonderful world through song." Rob found himself nodding as he read, remembering conversations where Ozzy had expressed exactly these sentiments. Behind the theatrical makeup and outrageous stage antics was a deeply sensitive man who cared profoundly about his craft, his family, and his friends. The public had seen the Prince of Darkness. Rob had known the gentle soul underneath. The letter included specific instructions for Rob about how to handle certain aspects of Ozzy's legacy. He asked Rob to work with Sharon on a documentary project that would show the real person behind the persona, to support young musicians who were struggling with the same issues they'd faced in their early careers, and to always speak truthfully about both the highs and lows of their shared experiences. "Don't sanitize my story, Rob. Don't make me into a saint or pretend the dark times didn't happen. The kids who look up to us need to know that we made mistakes, that we struggled, that we nearly destroyed ourselves sometimes. But they also need to know that we survived, that we found redemption through music and love and friendship. That's the real message. Not that we were perfect, but that we were human. Take care of Sharon for me, if she'll let you. I know she's strong, stronger than me, stronger than anyone I've ever known. But she's going to need friends who understand what this life was like for us. Take care of the kids too, and the grandchildren. Tell them stories about their dad or granddad that they can be proud of, not just the wild ones that make headlines. The letter's final paragraphs were perhaps the most difficult to read, as Ozzy's handwriting became even shakier and his words more urgent, as if he knew his time was running out faster than expected. I want you to know that writing this letter has given me more peace than I've felt in years, knowing that our friendship will be remembered, that the love we shared as brothers will continue even after I'm gone. That's worth more than all the gold records and fancy awards combined. I've lived a life that most people could never imagine. I've stood on stages in front of millions of people. I've traveled the world. I've made more money than a kid from Aston had any right to dream of. But the thing I'm most proud of, the thing that gives my life meaning, is the friendships I've made along the way. And none of those friendships has meant more to me than ours. If I could do it all over again, Rob, I wouldn't change much. Maybe I'd drink less, definitely would have taken better care of my health, but the music, the friendship, the journey we took together, I wouldn't trade any of that for a million quiet, ordinary lives. We lived, my friend. We really, truly lived. Don't mourn me too long. When you're ready, get back to work. The world needs the metal god now more than ever. Sing for those who can't sing for themselves. Be the voice of the voiceless, just like we always promised we would be. And sometimes, when you're up there on stage feeling the power of the music and the love of the crowd, remember your old friend Ozzy and know that somewhere, somehow, I'm singing along. I have one more secret to share with you, something I've never told anyone else. That night in the pub in 1975, when you talked about the spaces between the notes, you changed my life. But more than that, you gave me permission to be vulnerable in my music, to let the real John show through the Prince of Darkness act. Every ballad I ever sang, every moment of genuine emotion in my performances that came from what you taught me about the power of quiet strength. Thank you for that gift. The letter ended with a simple signature. All my love, always and forever, your brother in metal, Ozzy. But there was a postscript, added in even shakier handwriting, that brought fresh tears to Rob's eyes. P.S. I hope there's a dingy pub in whatever comes next, where two Birmingham lads can sit and dream about changing the world with their voices. Save me a seat, won't you? Rob sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, the letter trembling in his hands as waves of grief, gratitude, and overwhelming love washed over him. The magnitude of what he'd lost, what the world had lost, hit him with full force. This wasn't just the death of a rock star, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in music history that would never be written again. He thought about the funeral procession he'd witnessed, where tens of thousands of fans converged Wednesday on Birmingham, England, the home city of metal star Ozzy Osbourne, to pay their final respects to a musician who helped change the sound of rock and roll into something heavier and darker. He remembered Sharon's tear-stained face as she added a pink rose to the memorial at the Black Sabbath bridge, the way Kelly and Jack had held themselves together for their mother's sake, the sound of 40,000 voices singing Sabbath songs as the cortege passed through the streets. The procession had been both heartbreaking and beautiful. Rob had watched from a respectful distance as the hearse made its way slowly through the city centre, past landmarks that had shaped Ozzy's childhood and influenced his music. The Black Sabbath bridge, where fans had been gathering since news of Ozzy's death first broke, had become an impromptu shrine filled with flowers, photographs, handwritten letters, and personal mementos from fans around the world. What had struck Rob most powerfully was the diversity of the mourners. There were aging metalheads with long grey hair and leather jackets, but there were also teenagers who had discovered Black Sabbath through streaming services, parents with young children who wanted to pay their respects to a musician who had soundtracked their youth, and even elderly Birmingham residents who remembered John Osbourne from before he became famous. The Boston brass band had followed the cortege, playing brass versions of Black Sabbath classics that had sounded both mournful and triumphant. As Paranoid and Iron Man echoed through the Birmingham streets, transformed into something entirely new, yet utterly familiar, Rob had felt a profound sense of how deeply Ozzy's music had woven itself into the cultural fabric of not just Birmingham, but the entire world. But now, with Ozzy's final words fresh in his mind, Rob understood that the funeral had been just the beginning of how the world would honour his friend's memory. The real tribute would come in the years ahead, as new generations discovered Black Sabbath and Ozzy's solo work, as young musicians found inspiration in his example, as countless individuals found strength in the music he'd left behind. Rob carefully folded the letter and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his most precious mementos: photos from tours, handwritten lyrics, backstage passes from shows that had changed his life. This letter would stay there forever, a tangible reminder of a friendship that had helped define not just his career, but his character. As evening fell over Birmingham, Rob stepped out onto his balcony and looked toward the city centre, where he knew fans were still gathering at the Black Sabbath Bridge to leave flowers and share memories. The skyline looked different now, somehow emptier without Ozzy's presence in the world, but also somehow brighter, illuminated by the legacy he'd left behind. Rob thought about Ozzy's final request: to continue the work, to be the voice of the voiceless, to keep the spirit of heavy metal alive for future generations. It was a responsibility he didn't take lightly, but one he embraced with the same passion and dedication that had driven their friendship for so many decades. In the days that followed, Rob would share carefully chosen excerpts from the letter with Sharon and the children, always respecting Ozzy's privacy, while helping them understand how much their husband and father had cherished his relationships. He would speak at memorial services and tribute concerts, his powerful voice carrying stories of the man behind the legend. He would mentor young musicians, passing on the wisdom that Ozzy had shared with him about the responsibility that came with their platform. Rob would also begin work on the documentary Ozzy had requested, collaborating with Sharon to create something that honored both the public figure and the private man. It would be a difficult project, requiring him to balance his desire to protect his friend's memory with Ozzy's explicit instruction not to sanitize the story. But that night, alone with his grief and his memories, Rob did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up his acoustic guitar, the same one he'd played in that dingy Birmingham pub all those decades ago, and began to sing. Not the soaring metal anthems that had made him famous, but the simple, heartfelt blues songs that he and Ozzy had shared in hotel rooms and tour buses around the world. As his voice rose into the Birmingham night, Rob imagined that somewhere, somehow, Ozzy was listening and singing along, just as he'd promised in his letter. The thought brought a smile through his tears, and for the first time since July 22nd, Rob felt a sense of peace about his friend's passing. He sang "The Thrill Is Gone" by B.B. King, a song they'd often performed together during late-night acoustic sessions. He sang "The House of the Rising Sun," which had been one of the first songs Ozzy had ever learned to play on guitar. And finally, he sang "Amazing Grace," not because either of them had been particularly religious, but because it was a song about redemption, about finding light in darkness, about the possibility of transformation, themes that had run through both their lives and their music. The Prince of Darkness was gone, but his music, his spirit, and his love would live on forever in the hearts of those who had known him, both personally and through his art. And Rob Halford, the metal god himself, would make sure of it. The letter had broken him down completely, but it had also built him back up with purpose and determination. Ozzy's final gift hadn't just been words of love and friendship. It had been a reminder of why their music mattered, why their brotherhood had been so important, and why the work they'd started together in Birmingham so many years ago was far from finished. As Rob finally went back inside and prepared for bed, he whispered a promise to the stars: "I'll carry on, my friend, for you, for the music, and for everyone who needs to hear our voice. The crazy train keeps rolling, and I'll make sure it never stops." The next morning would bring interviews and obligations, memorial planning, and the business of mourning a public figure. But that night belonged to two Birmingham boys who had dared to dream of changing the world with their voices, and who had succeeded beyond their wildest imagination. In the end, Ozzy's letter had done exactly what he'd intended. It had reminded Rob that their friendship was just one part of something much larger, a legacy of music and meaning that would outlive them both. The Prince of Darkness had taken his final bow, but his song would echo through eternity, carried forward by the voices of all those he had inspired along the way. The letter would remain Rob's most treasured possession, a final conversation between two friends who had shared an extraordinary journey. And every time a young musician picked up a guitar for the first time, every time someone found strength in the power of heavy metal, Every time the music brought people together across barriers of age, race, and culture, Ozzy's promise would be fulfilled. He would, indeed, be singing along. Thank you for reading this heartfelt tribute to the enduring friendship between two metal legends. If this story moved you, please consider leaving a like to help us share more meaningful stories about the artists who shaped our world. In honoring their memory, we keep their music and their message alive for future generations.